We're joined this week by Jacob Silverman. He's now a staff writer for the New Republic and has written about technology and cryptocurrency. Welcome to the show, Jacob.
Thanks for having me.
I read an article last week in the Decrypt, and I wonder if you saw it, but it's by Ben Munster, and the title of it was Bitcoin's Critics, a Flourishing No-Coiner Cottage Industry. And it sort of at once intimates that crypto skeptical journalists are at once like basement dwelling, like, losers, and also like shills and ops for like the state, I guess, the SEC. I don't know who it's. And so my question for you was, how high the coins splash when you dive, like Scrooge McDuck into your money pool, which is ostensibly also in your mother's basement.
Sure. Well, I probably would save some money if I lived in my parents' basement, but I could use that right now. Yeah, it's interesting. Like people do ask a lot about like or accuse you of certain motivations or biases when you're writing about this stuff. Um, I don't have any crypto. I don't really have any stocks either. I'm not a very wealthy guy. Grew up pretty comfortably though. I do this because I find it interesting and it's a very, I guess, dynamic is sort of a plain word, but like there's stuff happening every day. It's always very bizarre and brazen. There are a lot of absurdities. So that's sort of one reason why it interests me. But I also think, yeah, there is this question about what kind of expertise you bring to crypto, whether you have real experience trading it, buying the stuff, being on exchanges. Um, I think especially as a critic, it's important to be pretty well versed. But I also think there's so much money and attention and really power and companies and behind crypto and pushing it and advertising it and selling it towards us that I think we need some critics and we need some strident critics too, and people who don't necessarily have skin in the game but who are more interested in it because they're fascinated by it or they want to uncover where the money's coming from or they have perhaps other competing motivations.
Right. Like, just a year ago, I started thinking about it mostly because I knew Bennett Tomlin,
Oh yeah,
and
he's great.
yeah, and he was available to come on like the first episode of our show, and it just sort of rabbit holed on me a little bit to the point where, like, back in November we were uh doing the series about Joel Greenberg and like fraud in Seminole County and his connections to sort of various crypto projects and everything. And at this point, it's like incredibly exciting to me. But for me, there's like this like almost like sort of fatalism in it. Like I I suspect that cryptocurrency embodies like not just our present moment, but I'm also, I fear a little bit that it's a glimpse of the future. And so I wonder like how sort of articulated your motives are as far as like cryptocurrency and its place in the future, right? And what
Sure.
you think it becomes.
Well, I think also to briefly address something you mentioned at the beginning too is that there's this assumption that if you're criticizing crypto, especially because it presents itself as a reaction to mainstream finance, that you're somehow a shill for or a defender of the status quo of Wall Street or the SEC or something like that. I mean, I actually wouldn't mind the SEC doing some enforcement, but I'm no on crypto, but I'm no fan of Wall Street. I mean, my main concern is that in a lot of ways, crypto does represent our future, but also crypto represents, I think, a worse future. Crypto in general represents more financialization of the economy and of everyday life, um, just making you pay for more stuff, attaching price tags and tokens to more aspects of online life, especially, but just life in general. And another thing, crypto is obviously has some libertarian infusion in it or foundation behind it. And I think in a lot of ways that manifests itself in how the crypto economy works, which is that if you lose money, it's you're out of luck. If you get scammed, you're pretty much out of luck. You're really on your own. You're sort of, there's sort of a term like homo economicus, like the sort of economic actor, the human as an
Right.
economic actor. So I feel like there's something happening here, like homo cryptonomicus or something like that,
Yeah.
where kind of a convergence of the human, the member of society is solely an economic actor mixed with what crypto does, which is it kind of turbocharges some of the things we know about capitalism and about sort of the libertarian, unfettered side of capitalism, and makes them even stronger, even more dramatic. So I could totally see crypto representing that kind of future. Yeah.
It seems to me that there's like kind of this crisis of what some people might call the falling marginal rate of profit. As the finite material in the world starts to run out, capital has to search out other like frontiers, essentially to conquer, right? And I think that the internet and technology in general kind of represents a way to invent new territory for capital.
Digital real estate, the big
Right.
craze
Yeah,
of that right
absolutely.
now.
Yeah. And so I think that is also somewhere in that transformation of us into Homo economicus.
Yeah, I think they're looking for new territories to conquer. It is sort of a frontier, as you say. I mean, even that kind of word is used sometimes, or to be a little more pointed about it, sort of colonialist or expansionist language and stuff. I mean, I think in what's now called Web 2, sort of the social media surveillance capitalist model, the frontier or the thing to be mined for value was our data and our behaviors, our clicks, and where we how we interact with the website. I mean, Facebook collects all of that. Now I think that it's basically creating microtransactions everywhere and making sort of your experience of at least online life be more financialized and more done through your crypto wallet rather than, say, a web browser. So I think that's sort of the frontier that's now being maybe colonized or explored. I think it's not quite as clear as like, just tracking people's user behavior, but it seems to be, how much stuff can we financialize? How many new protocols can we introduce? How many things can we get people to gamble on that they weren't before? I think, for some people that does create new opportunities for speculation and even profit. But I think it's safe to say that for a lot of people, it leaves them worse off. And again, this comes back to sort of the libertarian idea, which is that, the crypto maxis, they're not joking. I think some of them, at least, that they want crypto or Bitcoin to replace the dollar. They think fiat is flawed, or at least they claim to. And look, you can want that, but if that happens, one, it's going to be the downfall of American society just by having the dollar collapse. But also, lots of people are not going to be able to use it. Elderly people, people who don't have much tech skill. I mean, the tools aren't really there for mass adoption even. So that to me sort of speaks again to this sort of you're on your own quality for a lot of this stuff. But you're assumed that if you know better, you're supposed to be doing it because this is the way of the future, of course.
Yeah. So I was like browsing our Twitter feed for the podcast the other day, and Jacob, I think it may have been you that retweeted this, and I sent it to Michael. And it was a retweet that said, "This is all building toward big companies paying workers in their own made-up cryptocurrencies." Everybody realizes that, right? And I saw that, and it was the most terrifying thing I've ever read in my life. And it was funny because my mom works for a major insurance company, and I was like, "Hey, are you ready to get paid in so-and-so coin from your your company?" So
I think that this has always been at the forefront of my fears, or and also the thing that sort of interested me in it as well is that it's that, and that it seems like if you had a sufficiently large company that was willing to like sort of take the loss of whatever would happen in the short run of saying, okay, well, you can only buy things from Amazon with Amazon coin, like whatever the front end loss of that would be, Amazon is big enough that it could probably transition that into something of actual like value and with an actual use case and all this sort of stuff. But then what does Amazon become at the point at which it has its own currency, right? And what we're really talking about there is, the absolute like, if not subordination of the state to private power, but at least like an equity between state power and private power.
Yeah, I think in some ways it's sort of a return to 19th century company towns or something like that. I mean, I'm not the first to bring that up. In a lot of ways, what we're dealing with here is private money, corporations or companies giving out their own money. And that was a 19th century thing. I mean, it's been in other places and other eras, but in the West, speaking of the frontier, when the railroads were being built and things like that, you had companies and railroads especially making their own money, or own bonds, and for a while that could work. It depends. Obviously, you have all kinds of problems with that sort of thing in wildcat banking, but in a lot of ways, we're reliving that right now, I think. And there are ways in which, of course, you could imagine it happening with some of these big companies. I mean, I don't think it'll happen anytime soon, but Facebook tried to introduce a
Yeah.
stable coin, and they've
Right.
continually scaled down their efforts. But Facebook has also done things like build housing for their workers. So you can imagine one of these big Goliaths wanting to have sort of a 360-degree view, or possible control over their workers. I think it makes some sense, even though, yeah, it is troubling. It's another way to kind of bind people to a micro economy or a certain economy that
Mhm.
can be more carefully controlled, I think.
The decentralization of currency like represents a sort of a step backwards, like on like the civilizational scale, that like the efforts to sort of centralize that, even very quite literally in the United States history, one of the major projects of the early republic was to get, all of these, states, former colonies onto one currency, because it's it is inefficient for an economy to be running all of these different, currencies. To me, like that's one of the more interesting things in crypto is to think about, decline of our, of our states and our institutions, and that it should be no surprise then that one of the first things to go is like the coherent monopoly of state power over currency and everything.
Yeah. Well, like one thing we've talked about is that like, okay, so we have the prospect of structural decline going on right now, and crypto is seen by a lot of people as this like democratizing thing. And we've talked about this, Michael. Like, but for it to be democratized, in the way these folks want it to be, it needs to be widely available, for working class people to use. Well, it just so happens that, you know, most of these coins, Bitcoin, I mean, you see Elon Musk and Tesla spending, billions of dollars buying up, most of like the Bitcoin market or whatever. So it's like, for like the chance for this to have any sort of like benefit for democracy, to me, has already gone out the door basically, and it's just going to run wild. So
Yeah, I think there are a few issues there that you're pointing to, which is one, there's a basic distinction that we all, I think, have to make when we think about this stuff, which is, I'm not a big fan of the state or state power, but in the end, I think about it, and I do think that money probably needs to be issued from the state. It needs to be a public good, subject to political control, no matter how messy. As soon as you start privatizing money, which is basically what we're doing here, it it becomes chaotic, and it can become easily compromised in a lot of
mhm.
the ways we sort of refer to. I mean, just look at the crypto markets, including Bitcoin. I mean, which are incredibly volatile and prone to huge price swings. Besides the infrastructure not really being there to be real currencies, um, so I think, yeah, you have to consider what kind of relationship do you think you want to have with money, and money should have with the state. I think perhaps there's room for stuff that's made by private companies to sort of have value in this way, but sort of tokens like we talk about. But I don't know if it should be called money or it should be called cryptocurrency. Uh, I don't really think it should.
Securities, maybe.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like, even the easy comparison also is, when you're buying a stock, you ostensibly are supporting that company. You're buying into their sort of their revenue stream. You might get dividends or something like that. It's tied to some real world value. Of course, like, this is very complicated, and it's not always true. And you know, 10% of Americans own something like 90% of stocks, something like that. But of course, in crypto, there's no real underlying inherent value. There's nothing saying that Bitcoin needs to be worth $40,000 per coin, or even that a tether coin needs to always be pegged to a dollar. So there's just so much built-in uncertainty and so much sort of unreality in
Right.
the crypto economy, that for me, that means it can. I sort of doubt how it can ever be stable, really.
So, do you know about Alex Gladstein. You familiar with
Yeah,
Alex
yeah, I've gone
Gladstein?
toe to toe with
Okay.
him once or twice on Twitter. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's usually when I bring him up, that's what that's what I hear. Um, so he works. Are you familiar with the Human Rights Foundation?
I've
Uh,
heard of it.
okay.
I don't know a ton about it, but yeah.
So they have this Bitcoin Development Fund, which touts blockchain's ability to help like human rights activists in authoritarian countries. And the sort of exact dimensions of that are a bit unclear. But they've given away like a lot of money to people working on like educational and scalability projects, like relating to Bitcoin and mostly in Africa and Asia. About $1 million so far given away. But when you dig deeper into the like present applications for crypto under authoritarian regimes, it seems to mostly amount to like getting air gap devices into countries that have issues accessing traditional banking and the American dollar. So is cryptocurrency's most laudable application ultimately just about facilitating capital flight from places like Belarus and Venezuela?
I do wonder about that. I try to keep an open mind and sort of leave some room for saying, hey, well, maybe the remittance issue is sort of one of the last areas where crypto might do some good, even though a lot of
Okay.
people can send money via Venmo or traditional banks or Western Union, things like that. But certainly, in authoritarian countries or places where the rule of law has fallen apart, it's more understandable, I think. But, there are a couple of things you have to ask. Yeah, one, that is a form of capital flight. It isn't necessarily healthy for the home country, but it's hard to feel any sympathy for sort of for the government of Belarus, even though you may want its economy to be in decent shape. But you know, it raises other questions about sort of the differences in outcome and what does it mean when a few people might have access to crypto or to crypto resources in a country with a very volatile or troubled economy, but most people probably don't. And then the last thing that I also think of is what are they actually getting, and what company, what if you're exchanging your Nigerian currency for Tether, and Nigeria sort of has a troubled economy, from what I understand. It's understandable, but what is Tether? Tether is a company that's widely considered quite sketchy. I mean, I won't give the whole rundown, but
We've talked
you know,
about it.
yeah, some of these companies, put Tether aside. Even some scams are very common in crypto. A lot of the business models are basically Ponzi schemes. I mean, Bitcoin is arguably a Ponzi scheme that's basically based on the greater fool theory that you just want to sell it to someone who believes it's more valuable than you do, and that's where all the value comes from. So, like while we want people to sort of be in control of their economic destiny, I certainly believe that in most ways. I also wonder, what does it mean when the main alternative seems to be to connect yourself to potentially sketchy, unreliable, even criminal crypto economic actors? That I find troubling. I mean, maybe it is making the best of a bad lot. It is an area I do want to look at more too. I think it is how does this actually shake out? Because I hear people like Gladstone talk about on Twitter, and I do try to take it to heart. But I do wonder, is Tether the real lifeline to Nigeria or Myanmar that it's portrayed as? And I have my doubts. And there is also something to be said for the fact that, as much as you might see it as sort of a lifeline for a troubled economy, it may also just further destabilize that economy and undermine the monetary policy that's already there. So, some people might be benefiting from it, but it might arguably be a net negative.
Mhm. The Human Rights Foundation is kind of trading off of the like legitimacy of the sort of this entire international apparatus of like non-governmental organizations that have varying relationships with states and the UN and sort of all this sort of stuff. And so there's kind of this patina of like that legitimacy that they are sort of lending to these cryptocurrency projects, which mostly seem to be geared towards like helping people, in authoritarian countries who are already doing relatively well, right? And so
Yeah,
we're
yeah.
talking about what we're talking about, and I think this is often conflated, especially when people on the right will invoke human rights, is that they'll talk mainly about like protecting the property rights of certain other factions, competing, maybe sympathetic factions in these authoritarian countries, and that I think that yeah, I think you unquestionably can imagine a use case for, you know, uh, uh, someone in the competing faction of the ruling class in Venezuela who found themselves on the outs with the regime or something like that. But beyond that, you know, I really do struggle to to imagine it.
They also have to think like, well, what does human rights mean? I mean, that's sort of a general lofty question, but it's not just about money or someone spending power or having control over their own wealth. There's a lot more that goes into that. And what I worry about, I mean, I don't know if Human Rights Foundation counts this way, but a lot of people who do support Bitcoin ostensibly on the basis of its liberty enhancing qualities, if you want to put it that way, seem rather indifferent to other forms of freedom or human rights or other protections of whether it's about speech or really anything else. I mean,
Yeah.
this is a little bit of a diversion, but I always wonder this when I hear people talk about community in crypto or especially in NFTs and Web3 and stuff like that. Like, do you believe in other forms of community? Do you know your neighbors? Do you organize in where you live? Are you politically active? Things like that. Like, it doesn't mean that community doesn't have a place in the crypto world, but there's a way in which people's sort of beliefs or interests can be very narrowly focused. So if you're only focused on people's spending power or inflation, or protecting them against inflation, well, you might be missing out on a lot of other things, or you might end up supporting Nayib Bukele of El Salvador, who is not a small d Democrat.
One of the reasons I'm very interested in the Human Rights Foundation is because I think that like that dichotomy in the notion of like rights and community in the among Bitcoiners also exists in the world of human rights NGOs and everything. That there is a very conscious focus on like civil and political rights, oftentimes prioritized significantly over economic, social rights, these kinds of things. And that so to see the Human Rights Foundation find purchase in that world, it kind of makes sense, because that's sort of already the posture of the international NGO community towards human rights, is the favoring of a certain kind of rights, a certain kind of freedom over other kinds of freedom.
We should always be suspicious when a new technology is hyped and when you hear about its supposedly emancipatory potential. I mean, we heard that for various iterations of the internet, that it was going to connect all of us, create great economic opportunity. I mean, Facebook used to have a website, this was like 10 years ago, but I think they might have gotten rid of it. It was facebook.com/peace. And it was all about how Facebook was going to make a more peaceful world because people in India and Pakistan would talk to each other, and Palestinians and Israelis would talk to each other. But this is obviously ignorant of how power in the world actually works. And I think the same thing is true with crypto. I mean, who's getting rich? Mostly some early adopters and some people who are already rich. I think people also need to realize that the crypto economy itself is not built to empower people. It's built for speculation, and really wild, risk-taking speculation, mostly done by people who know what they're doing or like are real insiders, like the people who work for these companies or the people who work for the new hedge funds that actually trade on the platforms with high frequency trading software. Like, that's who's making money. With Bitcoin, like, I think it's something like 0.01% of accounts own something like 90% of Bitcoin. I mean, first of all, a lot of the Bitcoin doesn't even move. It just stays there in investment accounts or in accounts that are abandoned or people lost the passwords. So you have to there's 21 million Bitcoin, most have been distributed, but then there are a whole bunch that they're not in use. Then there's some that don't even move. So then, like, where's the liquidity in the market?
They're sitting in the coffers of your future neo-feudal lord.
Yeah, totally. There's a child tax credit that expired under Biden recently, and the child poverty rate increased by something like 20 or 30% overnight. When it's very simple. Like, we act like this stuff is complicated, but mostly people need money. They need fiat. They need dollars. They need healthcare. They need their jobs insured. They don't need a speculative cryptocurrency to lift them out of poverty.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated too by the sort of the predatory like tendencies. I think you'll listen to sort of people like Austin and I. We're in our mid-20s, and you'll listen to people about our age who are sort of just starting to get a little bit of money, and they'll be talking about sort of like their burgeoning like gambling problem, and then we'll pivot like seamlessly into the money that they invested in crypto. And I don't think that's necessarily an accident. I think that as sort of gambling laws have gotten a little bit looser in the United States, that there's been an effort to sort of market crypto in that same sector a little bit. And I it seems strange that, a currency, right? Something that, that's supposed to have this sort of like social value or whatever would market itself in such a predatory way.
Yeah, and I think that really gets to something that's at the heart of this stuff, which is it's called investing, but it's not. It's really gambling. It's often gambling where you don't necessarily know the odds or the rules of the casino, but these are much more comparable, these tokens, to casino chips or something like that. I mean, even Gary Gensler, the head of the SEC, has referred, I think, to Tether as casino chips. I mean, those are basically the chips that are used at most casinos. And the attitude and the marketing and the presentation, and sort of how these exchanges operate are a lot like casinos. There are a lot of giveaways. There's gamification. There's sort of encouragement to beat other people. There's so much hype, and this sort of goes back also to what we were saying earlier about the celebrities and stuff. I mean, this is an influencer economy and a hype economy. The whole crypto thing. There are no underlying fundamentals really. You might argue that there's some according to certain obscure DeFi protocols or something like that, but in general, there are no underlying fundamentals. So it's about who's hyping it, what kind of numbers are attached to it, what's the supposed volume. But a lot of those numbers are fake. So much of the information you get about crypto, whether it's on social media or wherever else, is not real. I mean, there have been studies that have found that most crypto exchanges are 80 to 90% wash trading, which is essentially fake trading or trading between accounts that the same person controls, which creates the illusion of volume, and it drives price activity and stuff like that. So I think what people don't realize is not only that it's not just more topsy-turvy or like you're taking more risks. It's a wholly unregulated and probably rigged and really kind of opaque economy that's running according to many different or totally different principles really than you're used to in other investment contexts. And of course, if things go wrong, like you're screwed.
You wrote recently that Mayor Eric Adams' decision to take his paycheck in cryptocurrency was embarrassing. Why is that?
Because one, it's a stunt. It's just to get his name in media and to please a bunch of Bitcoin maxis and venture capitalists and people like that. And it's really sort of a sop to the crypto rich, I'd say, or sort of those kinds of folks and that part of the tech industry. I mean, one quick aside, which I think is interesting, is that crypto does seem very divisive within the tech industry, I'd argue. There are people, especially gaming companies, who hate this stuff. But anyway, I think, I'm not some great nationalist that thinks that, American politicians should just brag about the dollar all day or something like that. I mean, Trump does say that he thinks that Bitcoin is bad because it competes with the dollar. But, to give him the slightest, smallest skosh of credit, there might be something to that, just in terms of when we're talking about political sovereignty over money, what politicians should do in terms of what kind of economic activity they should encourage or oversee. I don't see why it's a mayor's job to encourage the use of volatile private currencies that might harm people. And then the other thing that I would really like it to know an answer to, besides this idea of poverty alleviation, is like, what kind of innovation do you want? Because that's what I hear a lot, is that we're going to make Bitcoin or New York a crypto or Bitcoin hub. I think it was today or yesterday, Jared Polis, the governor of Colorado, met with Vitalik from Ethereum and said he was going to make Colorado into a digital state. And it's like, well, the stuff sounds good when you say it on Twitter, maybe, because like you get lots of likes and appreciation from NFT profile pictures. But like, what does this stuff mean? What do you want to do? What do you want? Like, what are we innovating toward? And I think that is one question that's still not really answered in some ways by the crypto industry. I mean, there's a lot of froth and excitement and money surging in, but
it's just hype.
What are you making? What are you you're not gonna overturn the monetary system. So what are you doing besides making sort of new casinos? I'm not really sure yet.
Well, and everyone, it seems like the really savvy players are the ones who run, giant discords where they all, pump and dump a shit coin, once a week or whatever. And then,
Yeah.
so that just as the pump and dump starts, you see all of these big whales, cash out
Yeah.
their shit coin.
I think people also don't want to believe this. Maybe goes back to the libertarian thing, or the idea that you're kind of striking out on your own with crypto, and you're smart, you'll be able to figure this out, blah blah blah. Like, yeah, you could be smart, but like, a lot of people don't realize that the level of manipulation we're talking about, or that there are pump and dumps on Binance and other big platforms every week, and that some people get mad at me because I focus a lot on the negative aspects of crypto, the scams, the manipulation, the rug pulls, and all that stuff. But I think it's important because, one, I truly think, I mean, there are ways in which you can probably assess this quantitatively, but I think it's a huge part of the economy. It's a fundamental part of the crypto economy. There are aspects of crypto that make these kinds of scams much easier.
I'm really interested in this too, because it seems like, what you ultimately have to prove, sort of within the argument that crypto proponents will make, is that there's something about cryptocurrency that is particularly socially corrosive, right? That seems to be like that's the demand of their argument. And so I think that that's the real challenge amongst crypto critical or skeptical journalists, is to demonstrate that there is something particularly socially corrosive about cryptocurrency. And I think about Kazakhstan, where, you see a country that's energy scarce having its energy crisis heightened by becoming, one of the world leaders in cryptocurrency mining. A fifth of Bitcoin's hash rate, or comes out of cryptocurrency, or comes out of Kazakhstan right now. And I think that's sort of the ground, I think, for making this argument, is because I think that the example of Kazakhstan becomes more and more applicable as we move forward in this century, right? That as more and more places, confront a scarcity of energy, that we're going to see cryptocurrency behaving as this accelerant, or as this corrosive, substance. And I think that Kazakhstan is really interesting to look at as a case study, because I fear that it becomes instructive, it becomes applicable as we sort of go on.
You have all these countries like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Kosovo, where the electric grids are basically being snarled under Bitcoin mining demand. So there are real material costs to this stuff. And that's why some of these countries, including some more authoritarian ones, want to kick up the Bitcoin miners, because it's no joke. And the idea that like you can just use stranded energy or renewable energy as if there's no cost to that either, is not accurate. And I think the social cost is something that we're going to have to really figure out, especially now that we have this new bubble. There's a great article maybe last month in the Associated Press, but it was basically about a town in Brazil where someone started a Bitcoin Ponzi scheme, and he was paying out high returns to people. But then there started to be all these competing Ponzi schemes. People were trying to kill each other. I think there were a couple murders. And I thought it was fascinating and troubling, but it shows how socially corrosive this stuff can be in the exact way you're talking about, because there were all these proliferating kind of criminal ventures, and it all undermines social cohesion and trust in some really remarkable and troubling ways. And I think also when you add to that a lot of these companies are just not trustworthy. And when some of these companies go under, when there are going to be more rug pulls and more deceit and more scams built into this industry, or more just lack of concern for what happens to people in this industry, which is another feature. I'm writing a story right now about Binance, when a bunch of Binance customers lost a lot of money during a technical outage, and they basically didn't care, and they didn't really even have a helpline that people could call. So it varies in forms, from the outright criminal to sort of the indifferent, but I think we're going to start to see more of that and sort of understand more that, this really undermines communities.
Michael and I have kind of talked about this a little bit. You see, for example, kind of like versions of the microstate, like Miami and New York, kind of coming up with their own coins. But we've sort of had several discussions at this point about the potential of like the larger state, the intelligence community, kind of getting involved in creating ops, whether it's funding certain media outlets basically to publish stuff that's critical of this and all that. So I don't know, that's been one of the more kind of fascinating sort of things to speculate upon in our conversations about this. Yeah.
If you have a need for black budgets, if you're one of
totally.
those kinds of organizations,
Right. Yeah.
you know, it's definitely in your interest for all of this to be floating around out there.
Yeah. Well, I
mean, I can assure you I'm not on the CIA payroll, but I'm sure they have an interest in crypto because, black budgets, anything off the books, money that can be moved potentially discreetly.
Like in the context of the Seminole County story and like, you know, Joel Greenberg, part of the reason that I think it fits within sort of the themes of our show, you know, is because I suspect that as we go forward, characters like Joel Greenberg will become, you know, more common, right? And I think especially if cryptocurrency is to continue to sort of proliferate, we're going to begin to see, you know, more Joel Greenbergs. And I wanted, you know, to just ask, you know, do you think we're going to see, you know, a diminishment of cryptocurrency, or are we going to see its proliferation? You know, will the Joel Greenbergs inherit the earth?
Well, it's very possible. I mean, it's hard to tell where we're at in terms of the life cycle of crypto. Who can actually know? I do think we're approaching some sort of major crash. I mean, we've had a pretty big drawdown since November when a lot of the currencies were at their all-time high. You know, crashes in crypto can vary depending on your point of view. I mean, for some people, a 40% crash is nothing, or just another day of the week. But I do think also right now it hasn't become sort of as kind of toxic or questionable as I might like it to be, especially for local politicians to get into crypto. This goes back to the Eric Adams thing and Joel Greenberg. So I think what you are going to see in the near future, a lot of people, this is a city coin thing too, which is cities are looking for more revenue. Politicians want to seem innovative. They want to seem on the cutting edge of things. They have partners or friends in private industry who can help them out with this stuff. It's easy to skim money potentially from this stuff, which I'm sure Joel Greenberg was doing, and to sort of work towards your own purposes. So I think a lot of cities, big and small, are going to try things like Citycoin. I think it eventually might acquire a bad reputation. I mean, Citycoin already has problems. The price of Miami coin has crashed tremendously, though supposedly Miami wasn't expecting a lot of revenue from it. That's one area I'd like to look into more. But yeah, I think there's no political cost really yet to this kind of stuff. So that's why you see even Democratic Congress people and others sort of paying lip service to crypto, because again, those social costs that we've been talking about haven't been fully quantified. We're still sort of in the frothy enthusiasm stage. You still have LeBron on TV talking about how crypto is the way to build generational wealth for marginalized groups and stuff. And it's pretty troubling, but like it hasn't broken through, I think, to the mainstream. There are a lot of people who I talk to on Twitter who think that these are all scams and risky, but a lot of people don't really see that yet. And maybe that will take another wider crash. I mean, I think the crypto market's probably around 1.5 trillion right now. It depends, you know, there's no reason why it can't go to zero. I don't think it will, but it's different than, say, a housing bubble where there's an underlying asset. Here you have a lot of leverage built in, a lot of stress on the system, and not really much underlying value, so it could be really bad. I don't think it would necessarily crash the overall economy, but you could see a lot of people lose, a lot of everyday people lose what they have. And again, I think you're going to have social effects. It's going to be a while before kind of a coherent sort of opposition narrative maybe is established.
Well, in the meantime, we'll enjoy diving headfirst into the piles of money we're all making, writing about it.
I love my fake digital money.
Right. Well, Jacob, thank you so much for joining us this week on COINTELPRO. You can read Jacob Silverman's reporting at The New Republic and a whole range of other media outlets. Jacob, is there anything you'd like to mention before we go?
No, that's it. You know, look me up on Twitter if you want. Silverman Jacob. Always glad to talk to folks. And my DMs are always open. Like whether you're a Bitcoin maxi or you're someone who's just been scammed. Of course, I lean towards some of those scam stories because I want to help warn people. But I like to talk to anyone related to crypto. So feel free to reach out.
All right, awesome. His DMs are open.
That's right. Slide on in.
Cool.
This is an independently produced podcast. You can follow us on Twitter at COINTELPROPod and support more of our work on our Patreon page. The link is in the show notes and in our Twitter bio. We'll see you next week on COINTELPRO.